tobacco products really don't understand addiction, don't fully comprehend the long-term consequences of tobacco use, become addicted to tobacco products, regret ever having started, wish they could quit, try to quit, and then still end up suffering these costs. So that comes about as a result of what economists call a market failure, information imperfections in the markets. It's like we have the clicker. All right, so in the monograph, we looked at the global evidence on the economic costs of tobacco use, looking at the studies that have been done in all different parts of the world. And what we saw was that it comes to the share of healthcare costs that are attributable to tobacco. Between 5 and 6% of all healthcare spending in countries around the world goes to treat the diseases that are caused by tobacco. We see that there are differences across income groups. High-income countries that tend to have more expensive healthcare systems. You see a higher share of healthcare costs going to treat the diseases caused by tobacco. You see differences across different regions. And then when we factor in those indirect costs, the ones that are associated with lost productivity, we see that these costs are enormous. These costs tend to exceed the healthcare costs. And when we put together the healthcare costs and the lost productivity that come from the consequences of tobacco use, we see that costs the global economy somewhere around $1.4 trillion US a year, almost 2% of GDP. That's going to vary a bit from country to country, from income level to income level, but again, significant costs in every part of the world, significant costs in countries at every different income level. So that brings us to tobacco tax increases. One of the ideas that economists talk about is the idea of using taxes to correct for these externalities, using taxes to cover these economic costs of tobacco use. This is a concept that's been around for a long time, the idea of taxing tobacco. How many people know Adam Smith? There's a handful. Steve knows because he's seen this over and over again. So this is my all-time favorite quote. This comes from Adam Smith talking about sugar, rum, and tobacco, commodities which are nowhere necessaries of life, which have become objects of almost universal consumption, which are therefore extremely proper subjects of taxation. So I've been working on tobacco taxes for over 30 years. I've worked on alcohol taxes for just as long. And more recently, I've been working on things like sugar and beverage taxation. When it comes to tobacco taxes, though, we have hundreds of studies now from every part of the world looking at how tax and price affect the demand for tobacco products. This is a picture from New Zealand. New Zealand has engaged in steady increases in their tobacco taxes, pushing the prices of cigarettes up, other tobacco products up. And as those prices have gone up, we see reductions in tobacco use. In high-income countries, we estimate that for every 10% increase in the price of tobacco products, we get about a 4% reduction in overall consumption of those products. In low and middle-income countries, we see even bigger effects. So what we see here is that there tends to be a lot more variability in effects of tax and price on demand. What we see is that on average, a 10% increase in price reduces consumption by about 5%. About half of the reductions that we get in consumption come because we see reductions in the number of people who consume tobacco products. So this is a picture from Brazil. The Brazilian government raised taxes regularly over the course of time. And as they did that, one of the things that they did was to reduce the prevalence of smoking among adults in Brazil. The reductions that we see in prevalence come because people are trying to quit. Smokers are trying to quit in response to those tax increases. So these are some data that we get from the U.S. In the U.S., we have quick lines, telephone lines that people can call to get counseling, to help them quit smoking. And what we see is that when taxes in the U.S. go up, we see a big increase in the number of smokers who are trying to quit smoking. We estimate that every 10% increase in price leads about 10% of smokers to try to quit smoking. And you can see in response to our last big tax increase in the U.S., the one on the right, as the tax went up, even before the tax increase went into effect, we see a lot of smokers trying to quit smoking, knowing that tax increase is coming. And then smoking is a very addictive behavior, but what we do see is that many of the smokers who try to quit in response to these price increases succeed in doing that. So in the end, about 1 in 5 smokers who tries to quit in response to a higher tax or price is successful in doing that. And what we see here is just looking at data from the states in the U.S. In the U.S., we have very different taxes across states, very different prices. And what we see is in the states that have the highest taxes and prices, we see that there are many more smokers who have successfully quit smoking, many more former smokers as a share of beverage smokers. And then the other thing we know is that some populations are much more sensitive to tax and price increases than others. A lot of the work that I've done has focused on young people, and what we see is that young people's decisions to start smoking are about 2 to 3 times more responsive to price than adults are. And that's illustrated by this picture from Chile. In Chile, they again were raising taxes over time, and those tax increases were a key factor in driving down the prevalence of smoking among young people. The other thing that we've been looking at is trying to understand how the effectiveness of tax increases changes as taxes and prices change. One of the questions I always used to get asked was about whether or not the effects of tax increases would eventually wear off as tax and price got higher. So we started to look at that in the U.S., and what we see is exactly the opposite. What we see is that what economists call elasticity, the amount by which people respond to changes in price, is actually increasing at higher tax and price levels. So rather than the effects of tax increases wearing off, what we're seeing is that those tax effects get stronger and stronger as tax levels are higher and as prices are higher. And then in the end, all this translates into a real public health benefits. So this is a picture from France. In France, the government again started to raise taxes and prices in the 1990s as part of an effort to reduce tobacco use. As soon as prices started going up, you can see that the consumption of cigarettes starts to come down, and then within a few years, what we start to see is a reduction in some of the health consequences of tobacco use. So the black line is looking at what happens to early onset lung cancer among young males. What we see is that lung cancer deaths start to go down within a few years after that tax increase. More recently, the government stopped raising taxes. You can see price flattens out. As soon as price stops going up, consumption stops coming down, and we start to see a slowdown in that decline in lung cancer deaths. So again, there's been hundreds of studies that have looked at these issues, all parts of the world, countries at all different income levels, and that led us in the monograph to make this conclusion, that significant tax and price increases are the single most effective policy for reducing tobacco use. The other thing that we've learned over time is that it really matters how tobacco products are being taxed. The tax is not the same depending on what type of tax it is. And a lot of what we've learned is embedded in a few of these documents. And the one that I'm going to focus on is the guidelines for implementation of Article 6 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So yesterday, Jeff talked about the treaty having sort of broad outlines about different tobacco control policies. But it's really the guidelines that provide the details on how to make that policy as effective as possible in reducing tobacco use. One of the things that we start with in the guidelines is the idea that governments should use very simple tax systems. They should use taxes that are the same for all products. The same rate should be applied to all brands of cigarettes, for example. And ideally, those taxes are what we call specific taxes. When it comes to taxes on tobacco, we have 2 different types of tobacco taxes. We have what are known as specific excise taxes. And these are taxes that are levied based on the number of cigarettes or based on the weight of tobacco products. And those are going to be more effective in reducing tobacco use than what we call ad valorem taxes. Ad valorem taxes are going to be taxes that are levied based on price. If we look around the world, what we see is roughly a third of countries that have tobacco excise taxes have specific only taxes. Almost a third have ad valorem taxes, and about a third use some combination of the two. And then there are a few countries that don't have excise taxes, but instead rely on things like import duties to tax tobacco products. The other thing we see is that some governments use very, very complicated tax systems. For But we see that in other countries around the world. They tax based on whether cigarettes have a filter or not. I think Nepal does that. They tax based on how long the cigarette is. They tax based on what price the cigarettes are being sold for. So when you have these types of tax systems, it becomes very easy for smokers to avoid tax increases by switching from products that are taxed at a higher rate to products that are taxed at a lower rate and available at lower prices. So when we start looking at the data from around the world, what we see is that, again, countries that rely on specific taxes, that have a uniform tax, have the highest taxes on average and have the highest prices on average. And when we start to look at these more complicated tax systems, what we see is that generally prices are lower as the tax system gets more complicated because consumers are shifting to the cheaper products, cheaper brands that are available in the markets. The other thing that we've done is to look at how these tax structures affect the variability of prices in the markets. These are data from the Global Adult Tobacco Survey. What we do is to look at the top 5 brands that were being consumed in different countries and how much variation there was in price based on those different brands. And what we saw, again, was that countries that have these more complicated tax systems, that have the ad valorem tax systems, tend to have a lot more variation in price. So there's a bigger difference between the premium brands and the cheaper brands. And that creates, again, opportunities for smokers to switch to cheaper brands as taxes are going up. And as a result, the tax has less of an impact in reducing tobacco use. So again, if you look at the countries that are here in the room, what we see is that countries that rely on ad valorem taxes, countries like Vietnam, for example, tend to have very big differences between the cheap brands and the premium brands, again, creating opportunities for smokers to switch to cheaper brands as the tax is going up. The second thing that we talk about in the recommendations is to make sure that taxes are being increased regularly enough to reduce the affordability of tobacco products. So in doing this, it's really important to look at how tax and price are changing relative to income in countries. If taxes are not going up fast enough to raise prices faster than income growth, then cigarettes are going to become more affordable over time. And again, that's going to reduce the effectiveness of taxes in reducing tobacco use. If we look at this, we can see again examples in countries where incomes are growing rapidly, where even though taxes have gone up over time, cigarettes have become more affordable. So this is a picture from Bangladesh. Since 2000, incomes have been rising relatively rapidly in Bangladesh. Cigarettes have become more affordable, and what we've seen is that consumption of cigarettes has gone up. So the same thing happened in Indonesia. For a number of years, taxes were not keeping up with income growth in Indonesia. Cigarettes were becoming more affordable, and as a result, that was contributing to increases in smoking prevalence. We did see, starting in about 2010, that the Customs and Excise team started to raise taxes by enough over time to try to maintain the affordability of cigarettes, so that they didn't become cheaper, that the tax was going up fast enough to keep up with incomes. And when they were doing that, what we saw is that as affordability flattened out, we saw that prevalence stopped rising in response. Unfortunately, in the most recent announcement on Friday, I guess it was, the government decided not to raise taxes this year, so cigarettes are going to become more affordable again, almost certainly contributing to increases in tobacco use. If we look around the countries in the room, this increasing affordability is unfortunately something that most of your countries are experiencing. Only a few countries in the room have raised their taxes by enough to reduce the affordability of tobacco products in recent years, which is going to, again, be very effective in reducing tobacco use. We'll spend some time in the next session talking about the Philippines in particular, where they increased taxes significantly reducing affordability. Another thing that we talk about in the recommendations is the idea of what level tobacco products should be taxed at. This is something where the parties could not come to agreement on what the recommended level should be. But we did reference one of the documents that WHO produced talking about setting taxes high enough so that they account for 70% of the retail price of tobacco products. So that made it into at least a footnote in the guidelines. Again, if we look around the world, though, what we see is that governments are far short of setting taxes at that level. In high-income countries, we see excise taxes accounting for around 60% of price, total taxes accounting for a little bit more. But then as you see, as you go across countries at different income levels, as income falls, we tend to see taxes at lower rates accounting for lower shares of price. And again, if you look at the countries in the room, almost everybody here falls way short of reaching that target. Even the Philippines, where they tried to push taxes up to get to that 70% target a few years ago, is currently taxing cigarettes with excise taxes at just over 50% of price, and total taxes just over 60% of price. The other thing that we talk about is the importance of taxing similar tobacco products at the same rates. The idea here is if you raise the tax on cigarettes, but don't raise the tax on things like roll your own tobacco or BDs, what you're going to see is that some smokers, rather than quitting, will substitute to products where they have cheaper taxes. So we've seen a lot of work, we've done a lot of work on this, trying to look at how smokers or tobacco product users substitute between different tobacco products in response to these sorts of changes in tobacco taxes on some products and not on others. And again, what we generally see is that products that are similar to one another are going to be what economists call substitutes. If you raise the price on one, don't raise the price on the other, people are going to switch from the higher price ones to the cheaper one. The last part of the guidelines get into a whole series of recommendations around how to effectively administer taxes. They talk about the importance of having good control over the supply chain for tobacco products as a way to minimize tax avoidance and tax evasion. They talk about using things like fiscal markings, tax stamps, track and trace systems as a way of really maintaining strong control over the distribution system, and then making sure that these policies are enforced. Just a couple of examples of places where this hasn't been done so well. This is the situation in the Philippines. So the Philippines did a great job of raising their taxes, but what they didn't do was to put in any measures to keep the industry from shipping cigarettes in anticipation of the tax increase, or what we call forestalling or stockpiling of cigarettes. So you can see that before the tax increase goes into effect, there's a big increase in shipments of cigarettes, and then after the tax increase goes into effect, the retailers are able to sell those cigarettes at the lower tax rates. It's going to take a while before that new tax rate really starts to kick in and have its effect. When it comes to some of the tax stamp issues, we've seen real progress over the last 15 or 20 years in the technologies that are available for enforcing tax laws. California was one of the first governments in the world to adopt what's known as a track and trace system, a system where they adopted these encrypted tax stamps that had covert information on them, overt information on them, where they could effectively track the stamp as it moved through the distribution system in the state. So what happened when California implemented this was that they also aggressively enforced their tax policies, and even though they didn't raise their tax, they were able to increase the revenues that they collected from the tax by getting rid of a lot of the tax avoidance and tax evasion that was happening in the state. The other thing that we talk about in the guidelines is the idea of using some of the revenues that are generated from tobacco taxes to support other tobacco control efforts. The idea of funding comprehensive tobacco prevention and cessation programs with these revenues. One thing we know is that when tobacco taxes go up, even though tobacco use goes down, we see increases in the revenues that are generated by those taxes. So this is a picture from South Africa. South Africa has year after year raised its taxes incrementally. As those taxes have gone up, the revenues that they generate from the tax have gone up. We see the same thing happen in countries that have been much more aggressive in raising their taxes. This is a picture from Ukraine. Over a relatively short period of time in Ukraine, they raised their tax 10 times. And at the same time as they were able to do that, despite reductions in tobacco use, they still saw significant increases in their revenues. And then we see from some of the work that we've done that when governments invest the revenue that they get from tobacco taxes in tobacco control programs, they see bigger reductions in tobacco use. They see bigger reductions in adult tobacco use. This picture is looking at youth tobacco use. as a result of the programs that are funded by those tax revenues. The other point that's relevant here is that when tobacco tax revenues are put back into these types of programs, that generates a lot of public support for tax increases. Most people don't like tax increases, but tobacco tax increases that use the revenues to fund tobacco control programs are going to generally be popular with the population. We did some surveys years ago in the European Union looking at support for tax increases when revenues are put back into these types of tobacco control efforts and other public health programs. Not surprisingly, almost all smokers support almost all non-smokers support tobacco tax increases. But what was surprising was that even a majority of smokers in some countries support these tax increases. They recognize how addictive tobacco use is. They support efforts to help smokers quit, and particularly to help young people not take up tobacco use. So again, when the tax increases are dedicated to these efforts, you see even smokers will support tax increases. And that's also one of the reasons why tax increases on tobacco were singled out as part of the development agenda. So the Addis Ababa Action Agenda around sustainable development, it talks about the effectiveness of tobacco taxes as a measure to both promote health, but also to produce a revenue stream that can help other efforts for development. Then the last recommendation in the guidelines is the idea of doing away with duty-free sales. This is a way for smokers to avoid tax increases. It's a source of cigarettes that leak into the illicit market. So again, the recommendation here is pretty straightforward to eliminate or reduce duty-free sales of tobacco products. All right, so yesterday Farouk put this slide up talking about the Empower measures and highlighting the fact that tobacco tax increases are the least implemented measure and have not really been implemented at all since 2014 to 2016. I can't remember who it was, but somebody raised the question as to why governments weren't implementing tax increases. So again, we have all this evidence that shows how effective they are in generating revenues and reducing tobacco use, improving health, reducing costs. The tobacco industry and its allies make a number of economic arguments that discourage governments from adopting tobacco tax increases. They talk about the fact that if you raise tobacco taxes, that's going to cause massive job losses. It's going to have a harmful effect on the economy. They talk about the idea that somehow tobacco tax increases are going to hurt the poor the most, and that when you raise tobacco taxes, you're automatically going to generate a lot of illicit trade in tobacco products. So again, if you just look at these arguments one by one, we see that the reality is very different from what's being argued. So again, the argument that gets used against tax increases, against most tobacco control policies, is that they're going to have a harmful effect on the economy. There is some grain of truth to this. If you raise tobacco taxes, if you adopt other tobacco control measures and reduce tobacco use, that's going to lead to some reduction in jobs in the tobacco sector. But what happens is that if smokers are no longer buying cigarettes, they're going to spend that money on other goods and services. If the government's generating revenues from those tax increases, they're going to spend that on things that tend to be very labor-intensive types of activities. And what we see is that any job losses in the tobacco sector are going to be more than offset by gains in other sectors of the economy. And what we end up with is an increase in jobs in most countries in response to tax increases or other tobacco control measures. So one of our conclusions, one of our major conclusions in the monograph is that tobacco control does not harm economies. Tobacco control is actually good for the economy. The second argument is that these are regressive taxes, that if you raise these taxes, they're going to hit the poor the hardest. That's going to, again, be partly true because tobacco use tends to be more concentrated in low SES populations in most countries. But there are a few things that turn the story in the other direction. If we look at tobacco tax increases, what we know is that low-income populations are going to respond the most to higher taxes and prices. They're going to cut back on their consumption the most. What you end up seeing is that then, because of the reductions in consumption, these tax increases are going to have a very progressive effect when it comes to health. We've learned a lot about the relationship between tobacco use and poverty. We talked about this in the monograph, the idea that tobacco use really causes poverty, and that reducing tobacco use is a way to get people, to lift people out of poverty. This is a picture from Turkey looking at the implications of tobacco tax increases there. What I did here was to look at how much different groups would pay additional taxes in response to a tax increase versus how much they would reduce their consumption. What we see is that the lowest income third of the population in Turkey would have reduced their consumption by enough to reduce how much they were paying in taxes, and the burden of the tax increase would fall on higher income consumers. The other thing that happens is that this has a real positive long-term impact when it comes to people being healthier, spending less on healthcare, generating higher incomes as a result of their improved productivity. So this is some work that the World Bank has done. This is from Chile. They've done this now in, I think, 12 or 15 different countries around the world, showing that when you start to factor in the reductions in healthcare spending, the increases in income, what you see is that tobacco tax increases have a very progressive financial effect as well. And then the last part of this depends on how the revenues that come from the tax increase get used. When those revenues get put back into programs that help support low-income populations, that target low-income populations, that offsets any potentially negative financial effect on low-income households. So again, in the next session, we'll talk a little bit more about this, particularly in the context of the Philippines. But again, in the monograph, what we conclude is that tobacco control is actually good for the poor. It's going to reduce tobacco use, it's going to have a progressive health effect, and ultimately a progressive economic effect. All right, the last argument that gets made is that if you raise tobacco taxes, that's automatically going to lead to illicit trade in tobacco products, smuggling of tobacco products. We've increasingly started to see this argument used against things like plain packaging of tobacco as well. A few basic points to make here that we're going to talk about, I think, a lot more in the next session. The first one is that even when there is illicit trade in tobacco products, increases in taxes, increases in prices still lead to reductions in tobacco use, just not as big as they would have been otherwise. So this is a picture from New York. In New York City and the state, they've raised taxes significantly over time. Prices have gone up. And even though about half of the cigarettes that get consumed in New York either avoid or evade taxes, we still see reductions in adult smoking, still see reductions in youth smoking in response to those higher taxes. Same thing is true where I come from. This is a picture from Chicago looking at what's happened to the revenues that are generated from tobacco taxes in the city and the county. What we've seen is that as local taxes have gone up, the revenues that are generated by those taxes have gone up. And again, this is despite the fact that about 2/3 of the cigarettes that are consumed in Chicago either avoid or evade the taxes. So you still get the public health benefits, you still get the revenue benefits, even when there's tax avoidance and tax evasion. If we look at the data globally, we see that the picture goes exactly the opposite of what you would expect. So this is something we put together for the monograph. Looking at the price levels across countries, which largely reflect tax rates in those countries, and looking at how much of the consumption of cigarettes was accounted for by illicit cigarettes. And what we see is that in countries that have high taxes, high prices, we generally see low levels of illicit trade. And in countries with low taxes and low prices, we see higher levels of illicit trade. So it's not taxes that are driving smuggling in cigarettes, it's other factors. And it really comes down to the strength of governance in countries. Countries that have poor tax administration, that have weak border controls, that have a lot of corruption, are going to be the countries that have big problems with illicit trade. And that's going to be a much more important factor than tobacco taxes are in causing illicit trade. So that's illustrated here. We do the same thing. Now we're looking at a measure of strength of governance, the Corruption Perception Index, for how transparent the government is. What we see is that countries where there's a lot of corruption are the ones that have big problems with illicit trade. Countries that have strong governance, little corruption, have little problem with illicit trade. And then the last thing is that if governments decide to do something about this, they can really take this on and still raise taxes and raise revenues. So this is a picture from the UK. If we go back to the early 2000s in the UK, about 25 to 28% of the market was illicit for cigarettes. They decided to make controlling illicit trade a priority, strengthen their enforcement efforts, adopted fiscal markings, adopted some of the new technologies to track and trace. And what they were able to do is, over time, reduce the amount of illicit trade, raise cigarette taxes, reduce overall tobacco use, and raise revenues all at the same time. So a lot of the experiences from the UK, from other countries that have implemented other strategies to deal with illicit trade are really wrapped up in the illicit trade protocol to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So basically talking about strengthening tax administration, strengthening enforcement, imposing strong penalties, and the importance of multi-sectoral collaboration between sectors within a country as well as across countries. So again, in the monograph we talk about the importance of dealing with illicit trade as the key supply side policy, highlighting what goes into the illicit trade protocol. So again, to summarize all this, we've learned a lot from the experiences in countries over the last 2 decades. It's clear that tobacco tax increases, tobacco control measures are really good, not just from a public health perspective, but also from an economic perspective. They reduce costs, they improve productivity, they increase development. So these are going to be very good policies from an economics perspective as well as a health perspective. And when it comes to the cost effectiveness of these policies, tobacco tax increases are the most cost effective strategy for reducing tobacco use. So Jeff talked about a lot of the population level interventions yesterday, the policies. These policies are all highly cost effective, but it's really tax increases that are the most cost effective. And then the last thing I wanted to do is just to mention what we're doing with Bloomberg, and that's to try to develop more economic evidence about the benefits of tobacco tax increases, trying to deal with those economic arguments that get made by the industry in opposition to tax increases, and to really work with local partners to develop this evidence. And you'll hear from one of our partners in the next session. So we're currently working in 16 different countries, 22 different partners on these sorts of issues. And you can follow what we're doing on our websites and on Twitter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Questions? Questions, Frank? Everything you always wondered about taxation, now's the time to ask. Yes, right here. Please tell Frank who you are.
Hello, I'm Lara from GC. So I'm just wondering why the recommendation for the tobacco tax is the tax about the percentage of tax share in the final consumer price. Like, because in Indonesian case, sometimes the government can have like a reasoning like, oh, we already have like this percentage of excise over the final consumer price. Like they can make some way of not making the tax is actually change the actual price. Do you get what I mean? Like,
Yeah, so
that's kind of confusing for me, so maybe you can explain why WHO focus on the tax share itself on the consumer price.
Yeah, so that came out of the WHO's Technical Manual on Tobacco Tax Administration, which was something that we developed out of a meeting. I was part of the process with WHO, where we had ministries of finance from around the world represented. We had academia, we had World Bank and IMF and others. What we wanted to do was to find a target that was something that was achievable, but that almost no government had met at that point.
Okay.
So what we did was look at the tax levels that were in place around the world, how much taxes is accounted for as a share of price, and try to figure out what would be a reasonable target to shoot for. And that's where the 70% came. So almost no government had achieved that level.
Yeah.
It was something that was feasible to achieve, and something that then created, sort of an aspirational target for where governments could get to. We also talked about the importance, so even if you got to that target, of regularly increasing to reduce affordability and those sorts of things. So we're still not anywhere close to that point. Almost nobody has reached that target. And we're actually going to be meeting in Geneva in a couple of weeks to start to think about revising that sort of target to factor in other things. But right now it's still, I think, a good target because Indonesia is far below that. every country in this room is far below that. My country is worse than Indonesia. So there's a lot of room for governments to still raise taxes before they get to that target.
Hi, my name is April from Indonesia. I'm newbie in the economic sector. I'm a health practitioner, and I wish you could enlighten many of us in the room about the complexity of the lobbying process on the technical level. I mean, just last week, Indonesia announcing that we are not going to increase any tax structure for tobacco this year, and we don't know about how it's going to be in the future. And maybe your experience in comparison to other countries and your view about Indonesia as well as your country, how complex it is actually about the lobbying process. What you presented to us is we got a glimpse about two-way conversations, the pros and the cons. But within the pros and the cons group, there are a lot of structure. Like the pros, like we are here, they're economists, they are health practitioners, they're lawyers. But at the actual level, when the lobbying process actually occurred at the high level sector, how exactly it is in real life. I mean, like 6 people in the room deciding and lobbying occurs, or there's people behind the curtain, you don't know who they are, they just have a huge power and they decide something like that. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated question. It's one that's going to differ from country to country. But I think to try to just some basic things. I mean, the Minister of Finance is the one that's generally going to decide on tax policy. The Minister of Finance's goal is to raise revenues. Most of the time, they don't think about health. So they're not thinking about how these types of taxes can be good for the health of the country, how they can then be good for the economy in the long run. They interact a lot with people from the tobacco industry. They're often some of their biggest taxpayers. Some of the work that we're doing in Indonesia finds that at the local level in particular, it's the tobacco companies that are the single biggest taxpayer. So they become very friendly with the revenue agency, with the Ministry of Finance. So they have a lot of access to make their arguments about all the things that are going to be going wrong if you raise tobacco taxes. It's a lot harder for the health people to get in and to meet with the Ministry of Finance to make these arguments. In a country like Indonesia, it becomes even more complicated because the Ministry of Health doesn't take a strong position when it comes to tobacco tax increases. So a lot of countries, ministries of health don't really have the capacity, they don't understand economic arguments. And that's part of what's happening in the Bloomberg Initiative, is to try to build some of that capacity, which really means have champions in the Ministry of Health to make the arguments to the Ministry of Finance to counter the economic influence of the industry. So again, part of what we're trying to do in our part of the Bloomberg Initiative is to bring in new players, people that have better connections with the Ministry of Finance, that are economists by training, that can do the types of research, develop the evidence that's needed to communicate directly with the Ministry of Finance and try to make these arguments. But it's an uphill battle because, again, the industry has a lot more influence in most countries than we have. We're hoping to change that.
Okay, this is a great illustration of what we were talking about yesterday when we mentioned systems thinking, which is a useful thought process to take into a complex situation. Later today and tomorrow, we'll get into things like stakeholder analysis, message development, and that kind of thing. Because the issue in relation to the question that you raised, the obvious answer is, well, we need more information. We need more technical people who understand it and who will stand up and support it. But the question becomes about those 6 people behind the curtain who are actually making the decision. Who are they? What's driving them? What are their interests? At the end of the day, as my colleague Ben would say, the tobacco industry doesn't care so much about cigarettes. They care about money. As long as they're making money and they have this power to influence government decision-making process, So that's very hard to penetrate. But if you can find something that's more valuable than the money will generate, perhaps that was a window. So everything Frank is talking about is, I think, necessary, but it's not sufficient to crack the issue that you're raising. There's more to it than just what the economics show. But excellent question, and one that you can explore as you do some more exercises. Other questions or comments? Yes? It's a race between Rolla and I.
Me first? I think all of us is Indonesian because, like you say, Indonesia has the tobacco taxation worst in the world. So, right? You are Indonesian all? Okay. Indonesia has their cake by tax limit maximum 57% in our law. So, however, we already achieved the limit. Even if we achieve the limit, it's still very cheap. Can we increase the retail price? So tax also will increase, even the tobacco industry will get the revenue as well, but the affordability will go down. What do you think about the retail price?
Is there any other way?
Is it any other way? Because to change the law is very hard, especially in Indonesia. So is there any way to make the affordability get down?
Yeah, so Indonesia has this artificial cap
Yes.
on how much of
Yes.
the price can be taxed, so it's
Yes.
set at 57%.
Yes.
But there's two points on that. One is that they don't get to the 57% currently, so they still have room to raise the tax before they would get to the cap. And the second point is that the price that they base that on is a price that the Ministry of Finance determines. So they can raise that price if they wanted to raise that price. So it's not a price that's set by the industry, it's actually set by the Ministry of Finance. So if they had the political will to raise the price, they could raise the tax to kept the county 57% of the price. It's a lot harder to try to get rid of that cap. So we did a lot of work on this last year when we first started working in Indonesia and found out that even though that cap exists, it's really an artificial cap because of the price being set by the Ministry of Finance, the HJE price, which they base the 57%. So it's not as hard as it seems. If they really wanted to do it, they could do it.
Okay, Daniel from Indonesia. I'm from Australia. Actually, I want to ask a basic question from your explanation about the labor and poor issue between tax, tobacco tax. So maybe we went to more explanation about this because so many people in our area in Indonesia actually who are pro tobacco always use this issue to combat our program.
Yeah, so the big challenge.
Poor issue.
Yeah, so the big challenge one of the big challenges in Indonesia is the structure of the tobacco industry, which is very different than what we see in most other countries. And it's because of that very complicated tax structure. So the current tax system, because of all the different tiers, favors small producers. Small producers are the ones that pay the lowest taxes. So what that does is brings in a lot of small producers to especially here, handle cigarettes and pre-tax. But what's been happening over time as the economy has grown is that you're moving away from the traditional hand-rolled tobacco products and moving much more towards manufactured white cigarettes. So what's been happening is that even though tobacco use has been going up over time in Indonesia, what's happened is that employment in the tobacco sector is falling dramatically. And the number of companies, the number of firms that are producing tobacco products is falling dramatically as well. So I think it was earlier this year, the World Bank released a series of reports looking at employment in tobacco in Indonesia, what's been happening over time, and what's been driving those declines. And it's really got nothing to do with tobacco control. It's got to do with the shift in preferences of consumers consumers away from the hand-rolled cigarettes, the hand-rolled latex, towards the machine-made ones. So, basically what's happening is that sector is starting to disappear. And tax increases would further accelerate the decline in that sector. But what could be done if the government wanted to do it, what we see happen in Turkey, what we see happen in the Philippines, is they could take some of the tax revenues that they would get and put those revenues back into programs to help retrain workers to develop other economic livelihoods. So we've seen that work very well in Turkey. Turkey used to be one of the biggest tobacco growing countries in the world, a huge tobacco producer. If you remember from, I think it was one of Farouk's slides yesterday, Turkey is the only country that reached the highest level of achievement on all of the Empower policies. And part of what they did when they did that was to reinvest some of their tobacco tax revenues in programs to move tobacco farmers out of tobacco farming and to help retrain workers in the tobacco industry to do something else. So the same thing could be done here. When it comes to the issues around poverty, there's some really nice work that was going on at the University of Indonesia, the Center for Health Economics and Policy Studies, CHEPS, where they were starting to look at the implications for poverty of tobacco tax increases. Very consistent with what I talked about earlier. What they saw was that you could reduce the poverty rates by raising tobacco taxes significantly. And again, that would come because you get poor smokers to quit smoking, stop spending money on tobacco products, start spending it on other things, better food, education, housing. What you would eventually see is that people would be healthier, they'd be more productive, their incomes would go up, and poverty rates would go down. So I'm not sure what's happened with that work, but it's, I think, consistent with what I described from some of those World Bank studies that have been done in a number of other countries. So yeah, the arguments, they sound really good. When you first hear them, it sounds reasonable. When you start to look at the actual evidence, you see that the stories the other way around.
Okay, two more questions. Thank you.
Dr. Boy from the Philippines. Based on your studies, do you really think that separate taxation on high value and low value segments would really improve the status of the health status of the country, especially those of the poor?
Yes, so high taxes on all cigarettes would help improve the health status of the country.
We have a policy of separate taxation for the high value and the low value.
I was thinking that if you will just not increase dramatically the low value, the poor will suffer because it's they will consume it.
No, so again, if you look at the big picture, if you look at what happens to the poor, they give up smoking more in response to high taxes. They're going to be healthier. They're going to spend less on health care. They're going to be able to be more productive in the workplace. They're going to earn higher incomes. And when you start to look at it overall, they end up being better off as a result of tax increases. And when it comes to the Philippines in particular, in the next session, we'll talk about what's been done with the revenues and how the revenues have been used to finance universal health care, and particularly providing access to health care for the lowest income Filipinos. So it has been something that's been a very pro-poor policy in the Philippines.
Hi, I'm Dorothy from Myanmar. In Myanmar, there's a burden of the smokeless tobacco use. The prevalence is really high there. In fact, it's really hard for us to control that because in our taxation system, there is no tax imposed on the smokeless tobacco, especially for the retail goods and things like that. So, and it's really hard and challenge for us to control that because it was produced by the street vendors or small producers. So it's really hard for us to control. So I just want to know whether you can share the experience from the other countries that impose the taxes on the smokeless tobacco successfully.
Yeah, so I think Bangladesh is the country where they're starting to get, so they have the same concerns as high levels of smokeless tobacco use. Their prices are very low, and historically taxes have been very low. But just, I think it was just last year, they changed their tax system so that they levy the tax now based on retail prices, which makes it a lot easier to collect the tax than what they had been doing before that. So they're a country where they started to be able to collect taxes on smokeless products. Really, and part of it goes back to enforcement, just making sure that they go out and start to collect the taxes from the retailers that are selling those products. So I think they've had a positive experience where they're starting to raise tax. We have a project that we're supporting in Bangladesh, which is trying to look at what the implications for smokeless tobacco use are. But again, if you raise those taxes, if you raise those prices, what you end up seeing is reductions in smokeless tobacco use as well. So good evidence on that from around the world.
Okay, thank you, Frank. This next session is a panel discussion related to tobacco economics, so have a chance to raise any additional questions that you want. But in the interim, well done. Thank you, Frank.